I don't think it has to be partisan at all. Example that somebody who once worked for Russ Feingold is in complete agreement with somebody who is from the other party and an opposite wing of the other party, that there's definitely overlap. I think there's overlap between the chairman and I on this issue. I think when you watch this unfold, you tend to see Republicans louder when Biden abuses of power and Democrats louder when Trump abuses of power. But I can say that when Trump moved the money around using emergency powers for the wall, I was one of the 12 Republicans who voted to rein in that power and that it wasn't appropriate use, it was abuse of power. I think as far as an adversarial relationship, there needs to be some. It needs to be the legislature against the executive like the good old days when we could combine Republicans and Democrats to always say, we are going to do, as Madison said, pit our ambition against their ambition, and those checks in power would be the way the republic would remain protected. We don't do that enough. I can't remember when. It's been decades since the legislature rose up and said enough's enough. We did a little bit in the 1970s. The Church Commission was a reaction to too much executive power and too much power within the intelligence agencies. But I can tell you how bad it is right now. I'm trying to get the classified Church Commission report from the 70s and can't get it. So the administration, the executive, but how is the only way I could get it? Somebody on appropriations would have to call up the current administration and say, give it to them or we're not giving you any more money. That's the way it would work, and it shouldn't matter which party we're in. But I can't get the classified Church Commission report from the 1970s, which I think came out of this committee or what committee?
Special committee.
It was a special committee, but I mean, it's like, it was a Senate product, and I can't get it. So, I mean, it's just kind of crazy, the resistance of the executive branch. I think everybody here understands how things got turned over topsy-turvy by Chadha, but I think it's important explaining to the public what we mean by that. The legislative veto would mean you could just come back in and the legislature could veto an emergency power or end it. And then the president didn't have to sign it. The court came back and said, no, you can't have any laws. And there's some logic to this. You can't have a law unless the president signs it. So the only way we gain our power is we have to let things expire. So the emergency powers have to expire. And this is getting to my question. Most of the emergency powers, I think as researched by the Brennan Center and as mentioned by Mr. Healy as well, are under IEPA. So previously we tried to do this and then we say, oh gosh, but we love sanctions. Everybody loves sanctions. We don't want to do anything to have sanctions expire. But if you exclude IEPA, you exclude like 90% of the emergency powers. And so the real question shouldn't be, do you love sanctions or do you have doubts about sanctions? Do you think sanctions should be forever and Congress should never weigh in? Maybe if you love sanctions, we should still vote on them. And they should expire and come back here in 6 months or a year and we vote on them. And if you love them, and I think the majority of people probably, I'm in the minority, the majority will probably still vote for sanctions on everybody all the time, everywhere. But there would at least be a debate and we'd put our imprimatur on it. And then by putting our imprimatur on it, if you love sanctions, actually the sanctions may be stronger because they're not actually approved by Congress. But right now we have no say in it and they go on. And most of the emergency powers, there's really dangerous ones, internet kill switch and things, but there's also ones that are used all the time, which are sanctions, increasingly used on private individuals in other countries, sometimes used in Americans in other countries. So I guess my question to all three of you, and we'll start with Mr. Healy, is do you think the reform that time limits emergency decrees and says that they have to be affirmatively voted on by Congress should apply to IEPA emergencies?
I think ultimately it should be under an approve or expire framework. Now, I think there's reasonable debate that can be had about, time limits and particular provisions or whether it should all be part of the same bill. But I think if you were looking down a list of extraordinary emergency powers, such as the Brennan Center has produced, it first came out in 2018 before the last two controversial uses of emergency powers. If you were looking down that list, you wouldn't have singled out the Military Construction Codification Act that was the basis of the border wall emergency, or the HEROES Act that was the basis of the student loan debt cancellation. I don't think they'd be anywhere near the top of your list of broad, crazy delegations of power. I think looking behind a veil of ignorance, looking at that list, you would identify IEPA as something that can be turned against U.S. persons and something that can essentially make people financial untouchables, and you'd be concerned about that.
I think you're right, and I just wanted to interject that during the middle of COVID, they took a CDC statute from the 1930s that said you can quarantine people for measles and like 10 other diseases and whatever other measures are necessary. And through that, the Trump administration canceled mortgages and said you don't have to pay your mortgages. Then the Biden administration did the same thing. So both parties were guilty of this, but they took a statute that had nothing to do with mortgages, and no sane person could think that a quarantine on measles has anything to do with paying your mortgage, and they abused that power. But that should be, whether you like people paying their mortgages or not, or like the rule of law, everybody should say that's illegal and unconstitutional. We shouldn't let executives do that, but we don't. We tend to base it on the policy. Do we like the policy or we don't like the policy, instead of, should the president be able to do this unilaterally on a statute that never gave him this? Ms. Goitens, on including IEPA?
I think IEPA raises unique considerations and should be addressed separately. I think the National Emergencies Act reform bills that are currently pending both go too far and not far enough in certain ways. I think that requiring Congress to vote 40 times every year on sanctions regimes, which is what would happen if you applied the NEA reform bills to IEPA declarations, would be impracticable and possibly unnecessary. And so I think a modified...
They possibly could be grouped as well.
I think
mean,
that's
if you have an emergency against Russia and there are 40 different sanctions against Russia, I don't think there's anything that says that we couldn't come forward and vote on the emergency that includes 40 different sanctions, not each individual sanction.
I think you would need to structure a system where there could be a vote on, with expedited procedures, on a package of sanctions once every year with amendments in order to strip individual sanctions regimes. I think that's
But once again, only works if they expire.
That's correct, but that's a slightly different framework than what's in the bills that are currently pending before Congress. And I would add that this approval requirement would not solve some of the other problems with IEPA, such as the absence of due process protections for Americans who are swept up in its crosshairs, such as the humanitarian impacts on innocent foreign populations overseas. So
I agree with all that. The only problem with separating it is Congress is, as I said in my opening, often feckless, if not most of the time. So if we ever do anything on NEA, it'll be a miracle if we actually pass it through and get it completely done. But I would say that if we leave out IEPA, we're leaving out an opportunity when what we're talking about is emergencies, and people are going to say, oh, you got rid of 4 emergencies out of 79 or something. You know, we're going to get rid of the minority of, we're going to fix a minority of the problem. So if anything, I'd argue for doing it all at one time. Mr. Thal?
I mean, so to answer your question, should it be addressed? Yes, and I agree that I think there are 2 concerns there, not with the intent. One is structurally how those emergency powers tend to work in practice. The second is prudential. And putting on my staffer hat, I remember negotiating about how much to include of IEPA and whether or not to. Look, as a principle, I think you're right. I just caution the committee that you have a reform or a version of reform that is within grasp and that could pass Congress and could get to the president's desk. Wholesale, including IEPA, just increases the complexity, which doesn't mean don't go for it, but it just becomes that much more slippery. And it's like trying to pick up antimatter with chopsticks or something. Like it just, the number of committees that get involved and like the Treasury Department, it just becomes, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good is my only thing I would add, even though I agree with the intent.
Could I add one thing to that just briefly? I think you're only going to get one bite at the IEPA apple. Take the time to do it right. Don't throw some provisions about IEPA into the national emergencies reform bills that exist right now. Those bills are ready to go. Get them signed and take the time to do an IEPA reform bill. The Biden Center has a proposal for legislative reform of IEPA. I would be happy to work with anyone on this committee who would like to examine that as a path forward. But move forward with National Emergencies Act reform and then take the time to get IEPA right.
Senator Ossoff, you're